Dobro večer vam želim i dobrodošlicu na posljednji događaj prvog dana trećeg internacionalnog festivala književnosti Bookstan. Ovo još uvijek nije svečano otvaranje, niti će formalno otvaranje biti presvečano, s vama ćemo vas još jednom lijepo pozdraviti i zahvaliti se na dolasku. Prvi specijalni program u okviru trećeg Bookstana podrazumijeva večer posvećeno našem ovogodišnjem kuratoru koje moderira naš suosnivač festivala. Naime, GEERT MAK, holandski novinar i književnik i sigurno jedan od najistaknutijih u Europi, kurator je trećeg Bookstana i zahvaljujući gospodinu Maku sve se ovih dana odvija pod sloganom granice i ograničenja, odnosno s ciljem preispitivanja imaginarnih granica i prevazilaženja onih formalnih. Večeras će s njim razgovarati John Freeman, koji je treću godinu na naše veliko zadovoljstvo s nama, koji je suosnivač Bookstana i koji je sigurno jedan od najznačajnijih i najvećih poznavatelja savremene svjetske književnosti. Zamolit ću vas da nakon razgovora ostanete još kratko u prostoru Akademije likovnih umjetnosti, odnosno galeriji, da vam se izvanično zahvalimo i pozdravimo vas nakon razgovora na druženje koje će biti neformalnijeg karaktera. Hvala vam mnogo za dolazak.
Hello, thank you for having me here again. Sarajevo is fast becoming a beloved city to me, probably my favorite city. For what it stands for and what Bookstan stands for, as a public space, as a pluralistic space, but also for the warmth and good cheer that you show me as a visitor, that you show all of the guests at Bookstan, for your stories and for your history and for the industrial amounts of coffee that you feed all of us. The man I'm about to talk to is no stranger to a coffee shop, to listening and to history and to stories. He's cozied into corners of Viennese cafes, snow caking the windows. He's bellied up to American diners, their sad-eyed patrons, those colossal portions. The quantities are lethal by European standards, he once wrote after one such American breakfast. He has stood to have coffee with sellers on the Galata Bridge over the Bosphorus in Istanbul, where street vendors get by on €1 a day, and he's talked to friends over espresso in his native Amsterdam. In European history of the 20th century, if it was a brutal, brutal thing, we're lucky that in the 21st century it has been retrieved into the present through such conversations and the journeys of one of the world's most compassionate guides, GEERT MAK. I use the word guide here on purpose. Dante made Virgil his guide in hell, and whether or not you think we're there yet, I contend that Mak takes his role with equal seriousness. Across many books, using tools he learned in several decades as a journalist, Mak sees the world through at least 2 time periods at a time. What emerges in this layering, as one critic put it, is a history of the present, where past and right now uneasily mix. Talking to people, listening, and you read his books marveling that he must be a very good listener. Mak elicits stories of desperation, migration, love and sorrow, of people who are blindsided by history. To one man he speaks to for his book, The Bridge, a meditation on the Galata Bridge in Turkey, history is the sound of a drum beat calling all men born before 1885 to a new starting war. That man never saw his uncle or his father again. The Bridge is just one of the books of Mak's we'll talk about tonight. 5 of them are available in English at Bookstan, and 3 of them have been translated into Bosnian or Serbo-Croatian. Hopefully this will give you a good idea of what a compassionate guide to the world Mak is and continues to be. But it also, I hope, will take you places. From Phoenix to the former Phoenician Empire, Mak appears to write the story of our lives, how we create public spaces like villages or cities. He reminds us how in those spaces we negotiate between intimate units, like the family, and larger ones, like the tribe, or even bigger ones, like a nation. how often that yearning is exploited in moments of duress for the purpose of nationalism or worse. He's crossed many borders himself to tell these stories and to listen to them. In 1999, for his magisterial book in Europe, GEERT MAK traveled tens of thousands of kilometers from Sarajevo to the tip of England, narrating a journey across Europe at the end of a millennium, while simultaneously narrating his way through 20th century history. A similar two-track structure holds up in America, which retraces the route the novelist John Steinbeck carved across the U.S. in 1960 for his classic travelogue, Travels with Charlie. 50 years later, lacking a poodle, but armed with a wife, and many of the letters that Steinbeck wrote while on his classic trip, Mak shines a light on an uneasy, ailing America, where 1 in 8 children are on food stamps. Mak was born in 1946 and grew up in villages I will not pronounce, before going to university to study law and sociology. He has been a parliamentary assistant for the Pacifist Socialist Party. He has been jailed for 3 weeks for what he said about the Vietnam War. Thank you very much. He has been a journalist for over 4 decades, and he's also a grandfather. It's a great pleasure to welcome him here to Sarajevo. Ladies and gentlemen, GEERT MAK. So I've been an annoying person to all my friends recently because when you read in Europe, you walk away with a million useful and interesting facts. But given that our conversation will probably focus on borders and boundaries, and that's part of the theme of this festival, the one that jumps out at me immediately is the fact that until about the turn of the 20th century, there were no passports.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk about what we lost and what we gained in getting passports.
Traveling was often a kind of elite thing. And a passport you needed you wanted to introduce into in a private home or in a museum or something like that. But Stefan Zweig is still writing that he wrote it in 1940. How can I explain to people that we, when we were young, traveled without passports? Yeah, I think life was in that way easier. But the problems with traveling, which now is traveling much more easier. So I think I cannot say that a lot of poor people traveled. For instance, in the north of the Netherlands was in the summer was full of people from the north of Germany, from Germans, and so people moved a lot. And I think the big movement, it was never so much immigrants. Even the immigrants who went to the United States, you always think everybody stayed there. No, at least half of them went at the end back. So immigration always has been a movement, and because we have borders, we have passports, and a lot of problems, when people are at a certain place and it is better, they want to stay there, and they cannot go back. So part of the problem is, strangely enough, not only the immigration, sometimes it is a problem indeed, but it is also that the migration back is blocked. And that was good in the old times, you could go back and that come again.
I'm also reminded that the biggest population to migrate to the United States from Europe at the turn of the 20th century was not Norway, of which 30% of the population left and went to the United States. It was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and what you know about how many people went and came back.
I don't know the figures, no. It was a lot also from Ireland, from the south of Italy to the United States, and I'm sure also indeed from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but I think it was especially the Jewish population, because there were a lot of Poles in Ukraine, in Russia, a lot of Jews went to Vienna, and Vienna was a little bit overcrowded with Jews, so that was one of the backgrounds of the anti-Semitism, especially strong in Austria. And what I understood from the history, indeed a lot of Jews went to the United States in that time. Read the book of Job, Job from Joseph Roth. That is such a fantastic immigration story of a very poor Jew who went to New York with all the problems he had. And I won't tell you the story, it is fantastic. It is also a kind of, it is a miracle story too. You must read it.
As you were talking, one of GEERT Mak's wonderful books is called An Island in Time, which is a kind of history of the village you grew up in. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that village. And as you were talking about life without a passport, in that history you also talk about the moment when, in the middle of the 20th century, people didn't pay bills by checks. They went and dropped off cash and had a coffee and sat down and had a conversation. It was a ritual.
Oh yes, it is a way it was what we call a high trust society. And it is till now, we are living now in the same village, so I know the village very well. I never grew up in the village. I started to come there, and with my wife we went to festivals there, and then I wrote a book, and then the village became a kind of a family. But till now it is, I think, one of the big divides within Europe, and perhaps in the whole world, is between city and countryside. Till now. We had just a festival, the Merk, they call it, just last weekend at this village. And you saw there people and a way of doing, for instance, a mix between very young and very old people, and they were dancing with each other, having fun with each other. And it is a reality. There are also a lot of terrible things in this village, but this is also this really, but going on with each other, and it was, I think, it looked more like a village festival in France, and even a rodeo festival in the United States. Then it looked like a festival in Amsterdam, and even in this nearest town, Leeuwarden. That is really a total different culture. I think my village, indeed, the way of living is also the village life in Ireland, the village life here. And I think part of the problems, I think, which when you look at why are people now, why you have a Brexit, and why you have all kinds of populist parties, there are more problems, but one of the problems is that a lot of people on the countryside are feeling neglected. We were in northern England just a few weeks ago. The same. London was so far remote that they had the idea they don't see us anymore. And that is one of the backgrounds. Another background is, of course, that you need always to feel yourself a little bit good. You need space to develop yourself, to travel, but you need also a feeling of place. And I think by the globalization, this feeling of place is also, it became a disarray. People are not feeling at home themselves in a lot of places, and they project these feelings on foreigners often. So the fear of immigrants is often a projection, and the real, let's say, the trauma is too big a word, but this is sometimes a trauma, is that people don't feel themselves at home in their own neighborhoods, even in their own villages. So I think the village life is very important, because I have learned in the village while I'm totally cosmopolitan intellectual and so on, but I have learned in the village that the feeling of place is also important, without being nostalgic, without being racist or what. The feeling of home is important.
You write sort of against nostalgia in that book, because I think it's very easy to be nostalgic about small, quaint things, and that nostalgia is often exploited. But you describe that many of the problems of our society are actually alive in their complexity in village life too. So you write about teenagers and how they describe that there are natives and there are imports. And that sounds a lot like how nations behave in their worst moments. Is there something in village life that turns that category into something a little bit more benign, or is it?
It can be, yeah, it can be. I'm hesitating because let's say when in this our own village there's now a Syrian family came, refugees. They took a very small village, but they rebuilt a kind of community house and they made a home for this family. Of course, very clever because they had 6 children and it was very good for the school, I must say that too. But still they were very well received, and I think that was really an honest gesture. That was their way of the village to show we will be part of the solution as far as possible for this problem. But still you see then that after a year, 2 years, of course these people have problems, are traumatized. On the other hand, there are always a few families, and it starts with the children, who are poisoned, still are already poisoned by the whole campaign against foreigners, against refugees, and so on and so on. You feel the poison, and it starts with the kids. They ran around this house and bumped the windows and so on and so on. The Syrians react sometimes a little angry. The parents go and they start even in our peaceful, blessed, well-thinking village. There is some poison coming up. And I must say, a lot of neighbors came and down again, so that more or less the problem is solved. But even there, you see how these primitive reactions are. And also, just because newspapers, television stations, discussions, they have heard that. Mr. Wilders, they have heard that for 15, 10 years, boom, boom, boom. It has its effects, yeah, you see. The same with the Brexit, the British press, the same with Austria, for instance, with the Corona cycle. If you learn in America, Fox News, they play a big part in the poisoning of people, the minds of people.
As a Californian, you're finally reaching through our conversation for optimism. So this is one of those moments. It's not that the Valhalla of multi-ethnic living is not to be found in the village. But across your work, it seems like you've written about places where a balance has been struck amongst an unlikely group of peoples. We're in one of those cities. Sarajevo's, in its best moments, can be the example of what a diverse and multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious city-state can be. Istanbul, in the best moment of the Ottoman Empire, was that too. You had Jewish traders, Venetians. Can the city-state be that kind of place, or will it always be as precarious as, say, the village because of human nature?
No, I think the cities can be a very dynamic place, and it can be also a place of immigration and of migration, going in and out. When you look statistics of a good functioning city. Sometimes more people are traveling back and going out than they come in. So Sarajevo is for me always an example of how it is possible and how much the dynamic of a multicultural city. It is not. It has its own problems. I don't think it is everything's fantastic, but I think especially for a city nowadays in the 21st century, for a vibrant city, it is an absolute necessity that you have a migration. You need migration. So it is not by coincidence. But, and then I talk about the 17th century. That Amsterdam did so fantastic well in the 17th century because it was full of immigrants. It is not by coincidence in the 19th, the 20th century, New York, exactly the same. And at the moment, I think that when you really look at where things are happening and where are, on a global scale, the dynamic centers are, there are always cities with a lot of immigration, but also emigration. That is really a new structure. So it's somehow the discussion now in Europe, where all kinds of immigration are evil and dangerous, is even not a 19th century discussion. It's a very backwards discussion. It leads to nothing. It is a discussion within the old and insecure continent.
Many of these cities we've just spoken about, this is obviously not a port city, but Istanbul, Beirut, Karachi.
Istanbul was dead for a decade.
Yeah.
Istanbul is an example. Indeed, it showed everybody who at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they were really champions, the Greek too, I would say. Both were champions in so-called ethnic cleaning. So around 1920, Istanbul was a totally clean city. And a Muslim, everybody who looked, everywhere. But it was also, the city was also totally dead. Nothing happened there. And now, slowly on, it becomes a little bit an international city again. And because Istanbul is a natural center for the whole region. So it gets dysfunction again. But Warsaw, the whole Jewish population is killed, almost the whole region. The city is dead. As a city, it is, of course, but it lacks all the dynamic of a 21st century city.
You've written across all of your books about the way that fear can be manipulated and used in moments of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
After the stock market crash in Berlin, to whip up anti-Semitism. And in Amsterdam, you wrote 2 pamphlets after the murder of Theo van Gogh.
Yeah, one.
One.
Was it? Yeah, there were 2. An answer.
I'm so glad. But did you now, 14 years later, has there been any kind of discovery about how fear can be used in moments of xenophobia and crisis that have been reapplied within Dutch life, or as in America, you know, the post 9/11 fear of Muslims has been tripled down on by our current. I can't say the word.
You don't use the word.
Yeah, the 45th holder of the office, is formerly known as the president. But
Don't mention the word. Yes, it's okay.
did the Netherlands, did those conversations, have they come back in a way that they have come back, say, in America?
I think partly in 2004, 2005, the whole country was in kind of turbulence. And a lot of discussions. I think also because when I look back at that time, until 2000, about that. I think we all in Western Europe, I said this often already, we were still under the spell of 1945. Never again, never again. Even if there were a little bit of smell of kind of racism. And I think we as liberals, I think we neglected too long and too much that there were in certain neighborhoods real problems with immigrants, not because they were Muslims, but because they came from very backward countryside, from Anatolia, from the Rif Mountains in Morocco, and I had, for instance, experience in Istanbul. They had the same kind of problems with the immigrants from Anatolia. It was as in Amsterdam. So it had everything to do again with the difference between old traditional countryside and a very modern city. But because of 9/11, this whole discussion was not. We had again, as Dutch, first to learn again to talk about immigration as a fact, and not immediately, oh yes, we didn't dare to talk about immigration because such a small country, it is impossible we have immigrants. We have 200,000 of immigrants, but so I remember I was teaching at the University of Amsterdam around 2000, and I had in that time, I had really to explain to my students, yes, I use now the word immigration. It was still in 2000. But in 2000, shortly after that, 9/11 started, and suddenly all those immigrants were not immigrants anymore, they were Muslims. So the whole discussion was also became a kind of religious discussion. And then the whole thing derailed because certainly all the people of Muslim religion and from the surrounding were dangerous, etc. and so on. The discussion, and in my pamphlets I wrote about that and I resisted that. But nowadays I think the discussion is still sometimes the atmosphere is poisoned and we are too much used to poison, and that is still dangerous. On the other hand, I think the discussion was also necessary because we had to talk about that, and we had also to talk, with certain Muslims, and we had to look the problem when there were problems. We had to look them in the eye, and there had to be. It was really necessary, and I think in that way it was a phase we had to go through. I think now, we have this Wilders party. He will never. That is also it's never more than 17%. Like in a lot of countries, there are so 15 to 20%. Racists and fascists and these kind of people have them, and they will always be there. But the big problem is that the parties in the middle also took over, and you see it in all European countries some ideas of the extreme right. So you see the party, the middle is walking more to the extreme right. You see it very strong in Germany now with the CSU, even with the CDU, but we had the same in the Netherlands, for instance, with the liberals and also with Christian Democrats. They have also talks about we defending our Christian nation, and when I hear this Christian Democratic guy like this, like I'm hearing Orban sometimes. He's not corrupt, that's the difference.
I'm curious, this is quite a broad question, but you seem the person to ask it of. Alexander Hennon, who will be here at the end of the week. He's been talking a lot in the US about nationalism and its dangers because he's from here and he sees where it leads to. And I heard him say in a lecture, nationalism is entirely dependent on a definition of the other, because the state is an imagined community, and when you imagine a community, two-thirds you would agree with that.
That's necessary. You can be a patriot. You can feel togetherness with your fellow citizens, and that is not excluding other people. There were already in the 18th century in the Enlightenment, when in some way in Dutch society and a lot of other European society, the nationalism was invented. We had a movement called the Patriots. It was a movement of enlightenment. But always their whole ideology was an inclusive nationalism. The other was, when he or her behaved himself well, he didn't disturb order, it's okay. So it's very well possible. But I would say nationalism is, of course, a fantastic drug.
It sounded like you were supposed to give me some.
Oh.
Only take one of these.
Sometimes I wake up, I think, oh, let me be for a quarter of an hour be nationalist. Oh, everything is so simple, suddenly. I don't have a problem anymore. Don't, because it is. So it is really, we were in Catalonia. My wife and I, because I'm writing a book now about Europe nowadays. So we spent some time in Catalonia last autumn. And we saw a young girl embracing the Catalonian flag and kissing it. And they were all, well, it was really like the 68 almost. A very funny, joking, it was really, it was, I thought, oh yeah, I want to belong there. With this group, you want to be there. But it was, of course, totally a lie. It was even a coup. And I wanted to tell this girl, but she wanted only to talk Catalonian, of course, not English anymore. But please take care. If your flag wins, you cannot study next. You cannot study in a foreign country and another European country next year. So. It is also an enormous lie, but I think the drug of nationalism is that it is the solution of the only story. There is only one story true, and that is the big danger, of course. Everybody, when you look at your own life, it is full of complexity and full of stories who are opposing each other almost. And in the life of the nation, it's exactly the same. And this imaginated community is in reality full with very different stories. But the nationalists are taking only one story, and that's that. That's the big danger. You see now in Poland, very strong. Polish, the Second World War is at the moment in Poland, they have even introduced a law. There's only one story, and that is we Polish are heroes. We saved all the Jews as far as possible, and we were betrayed by the West. That is the big story. And when you tell something else, now they have just mitigated it also, it will be under European pressure, but the proposal was that you could go in jail. So but it's always the single story. That's the big danger of nationalism.
One of the wonderful things about reading in Europe is that each chapter is set in a different place, and it feels like what you're doing is writing against those simplifying narratives. So in one chapter, we'll go to Paris, and you'll be in Paris in the present day, but then you'll also be in Paris in 1919. And this book was published daily as newspaper columns on the front page of NRC. So as just a fellow hack journalist, did you travel with an Encyclopedia Britannica, or how would you not pre-decide in advance the stories you were going to tell to complexify the present reality? Because surely once you found the story, didn't you have to run immediately to the library?
I used a lot of libraries, yes, and I looked I use a lot of local historians and local libraries because they are often very interesting. And I talked to a lot of people, and it was just, internet was not really there still in '99. It was starting, but I had indeed a trunk full of books. I had in my own room in a hotel where I always stayed, and I had even a bookshelf there in Berlin. Berlin was my outpost, and I had already on CD-ROM 2 encyclopedias. That is the way I worked with, and some phone calls. So it was, but when I was writing the book, and I must say the people of the newspaper helped me a lot. So I was always in touch with the newspaper. But when I was writing my book, I had, of course, more plundered a lot of libraries and so on. But it was, the internet was not really there. Still in 2004, I could work with it. It was later. With Steinbeck, I wrote that between 2010 and 2012. Suddenly I could, from that village, I could look into the libraries everywhere and fantastic archives in New Orleans and everywhere. It was fantastic to work. Yeah. But it was in '99.
Very
Yeah, it is now I'm talking about medieval times. When I tell you,
you come to Sarajevo in Europe, obviously. It's the last chapter, and it's very near the beginning of the book for obvious reasons. Where did you go when you were here? And did you go to the library here, or did you?
No, I just walked around and desperately to. It for me was I had to go to. I had a lot of. There was general history enough, and it was the last part of my book. So at that time I worked already with newspaper clippings, with the stories of my colleagues, found out like Franz Wesson, obviously too. He worked in that time intensively. So I had a very good fiction. He brought me also a lot of stuff. When you have a strainers of fixers, a guy from a Serbian guy, I was saying, who introduced me to a lot of people. So that was enough, but I wanted to go to Kosovo. Sarajevo wasn't, I had not in mind to enter Sarajevo, but it started to snow, and it snowed like this. So I got stuck here, and I couldn't fly away, and waiting for days in the airport with a lot of frustrated American soldiers. And at the end, with the few Dutch friends, we found a taxi to Split, and that's the way I escaped from Sarajevo. But at the end, from the book, I thought, why not? At the end of the book will be in the snow. Let the snow fall, like James Joyce in the Dubliners. In that way, it's good.
One of the lovely things about all of your history, and I know you consider yourself a journalist who writes through history, but is that you rely upon the diaries of well-known figures, but also the letters and diaries of completely unknown people. And I wonder if you think there's any problem to some degree with the way that we conceive of or write history as the actions, the willpower of powerful people. Are you writing in any way against that with the way that you write about history?
Yes, I think, of course, the actions of powerful people are important. But you never understand history well when you don't listen to what happened to normal citizens. For instance, I remember very well a woman who told me, she, as a young girl, she has lived in Cologne, and she told me about very poor, and her neighbor became member of the SA, I think in 31, 32. And she said, yeah, he became a member because he got new shoes. And people were at that time so poor that new shoes were a status symbol. They had never, for years, he had never had shoes. And suddenly he had fantastic shoes, he had a uniform, he could march. And the rest, Hitler, okay, but this thing. And this simple story explained for me almost as much as when you talk about all the machinations of what's happening in Berlin and so on. Just this simple story. The same thing when you talk with what's happening now, the divide in Europe, more and more between West and East Europe, between especially the problems with Poland and Hungary. You need to know that's how, for instance, a guy like Orban, people love him because he last winter he gave everybody for 2 weeks route in the villages, and the pensioners even got a month route. Now, that's very important. These very simple things, and also the feeling of pride. At the moment in Austria, Kurz is also, in my view, he's surrounded by fascists, his cabinet, people like him at the moment very much because he's on the European and even on the international stage, and our small Austria and always a little pushed away, and now Kurz is doing this feeling. When you read newspapers, you see it a little bit, but you need to know, you hear it from people. And so I think it is always very important to, when you write history, also to try to find out what people are thinking. A last example, I was in Wigan, north of England, Labour, totally Labour, and I was talking with people about, 69% was pro-leave, and also the leaders of Labour were very, they didn't understand anything about that because it is totally against their own interests. Till they talked at birthday parties, and a lot of their friends, Labour friends, they voted leave simple because they thought they could punish the Tories again a little bit with that. And so it is so important to walk in that way.
One of the words that comes up in several of your books is humiliation. The humiliation of poverty, the humiliation of defeat. And one image that stays with me and will kind of haunt me a bit is in The Bridge, the book about the bridge across the Bosphorus. You talk to a street seller who's living on about €1 a day. He's trying to get enough money so his son doesn't have to pretend he can't afford a Coke. And he's also lost touch with his other son. And he describes how the son he's lost touch with crossed the bridge one day and looked through him like he was an object.
It is, I must say, I talked with him already 3-4 years ago, but then he told me the relation with his sons is now better, his street family. But indeed, the bridge, also that the street vendor and also other guys, they were poor like hell. There were a lot of people, very rich people were running around, but they refused to start begging. There were some young boys who were robbing tourists. And they explained me even how they did it. But none of those people, they refused to step into this criminal system. They had their own pride. And I learned a lot from Orhan Pamuk, and he inspired me, honestly, to write also The Bridge. He said after 9/11, we don't know anything about the lives a lot of poor people live in my country and in other countries. And he said, so they are always, often they have very complicated and chaotic private lives. And that indeed that was my experience too. And for them it's also religion. Very, very important. Not in a jihadist way or something like that, but just Islam gave them a kind of frame to behave well, to structure their behavior in a very poor, very humiliating, very chaotic situation. And one guy went he was a street guy, even a street robber, but he went every Wednesday, he went to the mosque. I went with him once, and he said, that structured his life again. It cleans my head. That was, and I learned a lot from those people, yes.
I was struck by some of the stories that the street sellers tell to you about just who shows compassion and charity, and which I know, charity is a value of Islam.
Yeah.
And it seems on the bridge there is a whole ethical system that the street sellers, by and large, take care of each other. That at the guy selling tea is patronized by the police officers who'll go and then give tea back to his
of course. But yet you see it everywhere where are poor people. There are always there are systems of kind of social security starting. Often they start to help them to protect each other a little bit. And you were right. It was the bridge. It was two. Yeah, the umbrella seller and my friend Ali. He was selling matches and these kinds of. They were always helping each other. They were really friends. And there were more, but you must not idealize too, or for a lot of people, you couldn't cross the bridge after 7 o'clock in the evening. Then it was an totally other kind of.
No, there's a whole criminal enterprise.
Of course, there was a criminal enterprise. That too. Yeah. But Ali and the umbrellas and others, they were really very. Somehow they were very brave to go on with their life and to try to keep up some decency. So when I saw Ali, he earned almost nothing. And still he went immediately to the tea house and offered me a tea. And he had to work at least 2 hours for that cup of tea. So that was the way they were doing.
Yeah, some of the most humbling charity that hospitality I've ever received is from people that have far less than I do. You just 5 years ago finished this book in America, and the conditions that you describe in the book, you're not just writing about this, but I noticed them, is a vast gap between the very, very extremely wealthy and the poor. And I wonder what American poverty, which sometimes doesn't look like poverty. It's not 1930s John Steinbeck poverty. But it's still poverty. It's still disenfranchisement. It's still malnutrition. What does that feel like to you after spending time on the bridge with street sellers?
It is another kind of poverty, but this is not poverty. It has a lot to do with also this kind of humiliation. But the big difference is, of course, of America, is the American exceptionalism, we're the most blessed country in the world, and also the American dream. Everybody was always been, okay, we are in trouble, our life is not so fantastic, but for our kids it will be better. And that still Steinbeck travels around to America in 1960, and I followed his trail exactly 50 years later, exactly, only an hour, the same hour. So it was a joke, of course, but it was really. When I asked everybody, elderly people, how was it for you in 1960 and how it is now, half a century later? And always wasn't the same story. Life was difficult, but it was full of hope. And we knew that after, for instance, you got a job, you got an easier job, and then you know after a year you could buy a car, after 2 or 3 years you could pay for a house, after 12 years you could send your kids to college, your employer had, you were insured for medical expenses, and so on and so on. So it was also a kind of security. And they said everything is changed. And the biggest thing is we don't know, and we are almost sure that for our kids it will be not better, but worse. And you feel this anger, in that time you felt this anger already coming up. And I think that makes poverty in America also so more dangerous, because the poor, there is so much promised. To generations of Americans is promised it will be better, with kids it will be better, it will be better. And now they know for sure, no, it will not be better. And that makes them very angry. So in that way, America can become also, not like it was in some way, a stabilization country, very power factor in the 20th century. Of course, also they did a lot of terrible things, but especially for Europe, it makes also the world more stable. Now it is destabilization, the power of destabilization. Yes.
When Steinbeck was driving around in 1960, he too saw things that were upsetting, that were wrong, that were mendacious, and yet some of that he censored. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about what he censored, and also what he made up, because this book was published and given to us as children. John Steinbeck is close to Mark Twain and how much you were forced to read him growing up. Very close, but also a wonderful, as you agree, very underrated writer. Travels with Charlie, though, is published as nonfiction, and you kind of take the lid off that.
I think Steinbeck, when you're traveling in his, try to travel with him again, 50 years later, the first thing you find out, you think, how did he manage this? The roads were at that time worse. He had a van, an old car, bumping, noisy, and still he managed to start. He was at that time something like almost 60 years old, to start at 6 o'clock in the morning and go until 9 in the evening and met everybody, talked with everybody, and still he did 500 miles a day. You don't believe it. There were two reasons. Indeed, he made up a lot of things because it was impossible to have all those conversations in that time and all that money. And he was also, in reality, very shy. He didn't dare to go to people. When he started his trip, his car was full of whiskey, and he had an idea to park his camper with farmers and talk with them, drink a lot of whiskey. I think in reality he never did that. And when I was finishing the book and I was reading some memoirs of his son, I found out that he was using coke all the time. When he was dead, speed. When he was dead, they found a lot of speed in his bathroom, and he had he got this habit in the Second World War. And a lot of soldiers were using speed in that time. So that was the reason he could drive like hell. But he was in his letters, he was rather negative. He talked about America as a dead corpse full of gases, which could explode every moment. In reality, after 1960, America changed a lot. There was really the whole, there came new laws against segregation. Lyndon Johnson came with enormous social programs. I think till the 80s, you can say the New Deal went still on, and the life of people was improved. So the prophecy of Steinbeck didn't came out, but he was too pessimistic, and his editor said you cannot do it. So the book was edited and changed a lot, and at the end, The Travels with Charles is a very funny, optimistic, so-called non-fiction book, but it is totally fiction. But it is still a very interesting book, because it was very popular in the 60s, because probably it was a book that was the mirror the Americans liked to see themselves. And this is our America. And so it shows a lot still, even in an idealized way, a lot about American 60s. So it was a good guide. And it was, of course, also fantastic to travel in Australia and to find a lot of things.
Yeah, I appreciate your book because it doesn't cut out the things which are unpleasant. So when he passes a strip mall, which is kind of ugly, he describes it. When he goes to an inn in Vermont that feels like it's a museum of quaintness, he describes that feeling. When he goes to a checkout counter in Phoenix, Arizona, and a woman taking his bill is 80 years old, and her hands are shaking, he talks about that. And yet you still love it. Why do you love it? I ask myself this question at the same time, because I love and hate America in equal measures. And if I could just hate it, I would leave it.
Yeah, for me, my feelings of America, but Americans are the same. But when at the same argument, I hate it, I love it, I love it, and hate it. It's always, it is still a fascinating country. But when I was working on this book, when I was traveling around, not so much. I had the idea. Sometimes we both had the idea, my wife and I, we thought, this is a third world country, and sometimes even more in this so-called flyover country. But when I was writing, I thought also this can be also when all this hidden disappointments comes to the light, and people are talking about it, and it can be also become a very dangerous country. And I thought when I was writing it about a theory. In theory, it can be a dangerous country, but I never could imagine that it so soon already would happen in reality.
I'm going to optimistically turn to something nice you just said, and then we can get to tyranny. I was surprised because as a reader, I often assume that all writers from Europe are atheists, but you're the son of a clergyman, and it seems that the place, or at least one of the places you felt most at home, most accepted, where boundaries were most easily crossed, was in a church in Camden, Maine.
Maine, in Camden, but there was another church in not far from, more a little bit, not so far from Chicago, and that was funny. That was a Dutch Reformed church. It was totally American, but it was full with people who were once they were immigrants from Holland, and even the same religious group I grew up. So I came there, and the man, there was a man coming out of church, and he was kind of a warden, and he said to me, oh, you are GEERT MAK? Yes. Oh, welcome, and but take care, they are very heavy here, and heavy stuff here, but I put you at the back, and if you don't like it anymore, you can smuggle you out. But it was for me not the travel to America, but the travel in time. Suddenly I was a young boy in the 50s, in the church of my parents, and they had exactly the same formulas, the same rituals, it was only in English. And they were all Americans, they were really all Americans, but in the same way they were totally Dutch. But that's interesting, though. You see, it's often with immigrants, they were frozen in 1953. Even this very strong Calvinistic churches are changed in the Netherlands, and they were totally frozen in 53. But it was interesting, and I got another peppermint, and I feel in some way I felt myself really at home.
And in Maine, you described how people took you to lunch and patted you on the back. They basically welcomed you into their community instantly.
That's the good thing of America.
Yeah,
but you, as an immigrant, go to a church. When you totally go to a church at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they will help you, really.
Yeah, the Catholic Charities does wonderful things for people who are not Catholic, for example. So what mutates in American religiosity? Because on one hand, you point out something I did not know, which is that of the 4/5 of Americans who believe they have an individual relationship with God, a huge percentage of them are involved in charitable works. And on the atheist side, 1 in 6 people do charity. And yet you look at how religion is used to deny women the right to control what their bodies do, how religion is used to penalize homosexuals, how religion is used to drive elections in very mendacious ways. The force of religion can also be deeply corrosive. So where does it mutate for you when you travel the country? Where did you see it sort of turning into something that was uncharitable?
Now, I think often it is double, but then you have it with all religions. But I think as a Protestant, the Protestants are also do the same thing as everybody else, but they have some straw, and you can talk with them about that. And how is that okay? And I see a lot of American Protestants, and I can believe my ears and my eyes, and the so-called evangelicals, they accepting Donald Trump as the president. I think they pray for him even, while he is walking over all those principles. And I think, where as a Protestant to another Protestant, former Protestant, where are your principles anymore? That's the one thing. That's totally. But in America, you see also that nationalism and religion are more and more intertwined, just like in Poland. Poland is also, the nationalism is very religious. And next to that, you see, and that is, in my view, very, very dangerous, a kind of American so-called Christianity, a very strange, even violent, jihadist kind of Christianity, which is talking about a lot. They're talking about the latest judgment, about the last big fight between good and evil somewhere behind, at the back of Jerusalem, and 20-30% of Americans are believing this kind of stuff. There's nothing in the Bible about it.
No, I think the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem was not for Jewish voters, it was for right-wing Christian voters.
Yeah, and this kind of Christianity. In America was very popular, the Left Behind series. Books about it's too long story, it's a fantastic story, but too long to talk about. What's happening when Christ will come back and people get still some time to make their life in order to come to heaven or not. But so many Americans really believe that this struggle is there, Israel is playing an enormous part in it, and it is a very aggressive way to be Christian. It is typical, in my view, it has nothing to do with the Christian tradition. It is a typical, strange way of the strange, typical American religion. And I think that can be very dangerous. Because I think more than we think, these drug politics are driven, of course, by Russian influences, but also by this kind of religious influences.
I have two more questions, and then I'll open it up to you. The index of this book is kind of a thing of beauty. It's got everything from Cadillacs to Elvis Presley to Pepsi to the Pony Express. But the one person it does not include is Donald Trump. You have written a 500-page book about traveling to America in 2010, and Donald Trump does not come up. And I wonder, did you edit him out?
No.
Did you see him on TV?
He was not really. He came up after that, and a lot of people are telling the story that when he was jubilated at a correspondence dinner in 2012, I believe, that was not the first time, but it was the moment he decided to run for president. So there are more interesting and important Americans. But Trump could have been in this book about Europe, about the small village, because when I was preparing this book, in the pub, everybody was talking about a big shipyard in a place called, not far from this village, Mak. And this shipyard, they were specialized in building yachts. And the people who worked there, sometimes they were in the pub, and sometimes people in big stories, birthday parties. They were building for everybody and for very rich people. And in that time they talked about there was an American and he was building the biggest yacht in the world. They were very enthusiastic and they were really good, very good craftsmen. And they were working half a year, 3/4 a year just to this yacht. And then this American suddenly didn't want to pay anymore, and he couldn't pay anymore. So the shipyard totally, the whole yard collapsed, and they had to fire people, and it was in this region, it was a big problem. And they wanted to sue him, and this guy was so clever, because all those problems, this yard was very cheap, could be bought for a few million. And this American just bought the shipyard to avoid all the lawsuits. And with a lot of problems and troubles and human misery, at the end, this simple, free, hard-working people came out of this mess again after years. This American guy was Donald Trump. So this was the first time I met Donald Trump. Not in America, but in a Frisian village, which went almost totally broke.
Unfortunately, that seems to be a familiar Trump story, that he goes to make money, if he doesn't make money, then everyone gets fired. I want to read one final thing from your this book in America, which you write very well about Joseph McCarthy. No, not you. You don't compliment him, but you describe what he does very well, and you say, in the real world, his activities mainly caused political chaos and a great deal of personal misery. His success was based purely on his magical slogans. The term had not yet been invented, but McCarthy was a master of framing, the technique of gaining control of a complicated and possibly threatening situation by means of a few turns of phrase, reducing it to a simple and attractive falsehood. The reporters loved him. Every day he furnished them with news and easily manageable quotations, and they swallowed everything, even when they knew better. McCarthy was a dream story, one of them recalled later. I wasn't off the front page for 4 years. And I wonder now I'm asking you for personal reasons, so I don't go insane in the next 2 years. But if there is to be some sort of resistance to some of the policies that Trump has, and he is so effective at framing American life within certain slogans and fantasies, how do you fight that? Because if everyone could read your books, I would think that they would perhaps vote in a more enlightened way. But the reality is these slogans work.
Of course, in America, Americans love it. But I said, when I was, of course, when Donald Trump, the rise of Donald Trump, in that time, I thought often about McCarthy. And that was also my hope, I thought. But as a journalist, I know very well that McCarthy was helped a lot by the newspapers. I'm afraid even the New York Times, the Washington Post, because he made headlines every day. He had always a good quote. Trump exactly the same. This is kind of meat and bones for journalists. And the good thing about, you saw at the history of McCarthy, at the end it fell flat. It was enough. But with McCarthy, and this is a big difference, there was also the checks and balances of the American system worked slowly, but they worked. So at the end, he fell flat at all those hearings. The press turned against him, and he didn't have an answer. And the juridical system went some way with him, but it was not. There was a Supreme Court which functioned rather well, which you could trust, and the politics were not as polarized and corrupted as they are now, especially the Republican Party. So a big problem now with Donald Trump is that the checks and balances which the founding fathers and all their wisdom put in the American system, I'm afraid they are still not working, and I'm afraid that it will take a long time before they start working, if they ever start working. That's the problem.
I was really hoping to end on an optimistic note.
But perhaps there was one thing, everybody was afraid of McCarthy, and suddenly there was a senator who said to him, what was it?
Oh, have you no decency, sir?
Yeah.
Have you no decency at all?
Yeah, exactly. And that was the moment that McCarthy did something very stupid. He started to attack the army. And at that moment, suddenly the mood turned around. But, then was suddenly a senator. Don't you have any decency at all? And also, I remember Ted Murrow, wasn't it Ted Murrow, started also a frontal attack on him. And that was the moment. And perhaps we will see such a miracle, and honestly, with the last part of my Protestantism, I pray every evening for that.
Well, if you want to go back in time to a world without Trump, In America is your book. GEERT MAK, it was a pleasure talking to you. Does anybody have a question for him about Europe, about migration, about Amsterdam, about the book he's working on right now? or was everyone very depressed and hungry for beer? There's a question in the back, beneath the TV.
Hello. Thank you very much for this great conversation, but I was missing the whole time one thing that you didn't mention when talking about the causes of the situation that we are in, I say we and the whole planet, and that is a class issue. Socialism has been a taboo or a swear word for the last 30 years in Europe and in the United States even longer. And it seems that class issue was missing from your conversation. I was wondering whether you would put it in one of the causes, especially in the urban centers where the poverty is a class issue, and the type of economy that globalism that we are living. And you also didn't mention that in the countries that you were talking about, like Turkey or Poland, there were quite prominent socialist movements. And for the past 30 years, my feeling is that it has been suppressed much more than any religious or any other type of worldview. So I was wondering, would you include this in the causes of this situation now?
I think I think it's a good time to use that word again, to introduce more than ever. So you are totally right. We talked about so many things. But I'm now working on a book about the last 20 years, follow-up of in Europe. What happened with Europe and also with the international situation since 1999. And when I come to the sources of it, is the first thing and the most important thing is the introduction of the new liberalism. And a long time it was a kind of slogan, it was seen as a kind of slogan, but it is just an economic theory. But it became a kind of religious belief. The problem with neoliberalism is that it doesn't accept any kind of discussion. It is only about the figures and the market, and the figures and the market are always right. So what happened with Greece, for instance, which was almost killed by the austerity measures of the Eurozone, and even at the end, the EMF was protesting like hell because it was against all even capitalistic economic law. It was totally neoliberalism. The market is always right, and that is the big discussion I think now within Europe. The Germans are still in the Dutch too, full of this ideology. But for instance, the French are much more thinking about a more protective, inclusive Europe. Orban and others are more thinking about Christian Europe. But the neoliberal, the ideology, sorry, I'm a little tired, of neoliberalism, I think what we see now is everywhere a kind of a revolution against this ideology. And like all revolutions, it is often in a very strange, unexpected, and even also idiotic way. But what's happening in Greece, but also in Italy, in the parties in Spain, but also the Brexit, and I don't like at all what happened there, but it is a big resistance against this way of thinking. It's it is not an explanation for the whole situation, but it is for sure it is a part of the problem. Yes, for sure. And I think that the thinking about that is changing now rapidly. A lot of people are saying that we cannot go on in that way because it is not true. There is more in life than figures and market. There are more other things which are so important. But this narrow-minded way of thinking about society, about economy, about politics, yeah, we pay now the price for sure. And I hope that is really a thing that makes me optimistic, that a lot of people are thinking about that and that it is changing.
There's an interesting part of his book in Europe where he describes how sometimes off the front in World War I, the French soldiers would go into battle singing socialist worker songs because they felt like they were being commodified. So if you look in his books, there's quite a bit about actually socialism and Adlai Stevenson's loss in America, but we should have probably brought it up earlier. We're out of time, so I think Dahmer or someone standing behind me will say something brief, and then there will be time for coffee and beer and other fancy things.
John Freeman, suosnivač Bookstana, u uvodniku našeg kataloga je između ostalog napisao kako nigdje nije sreo tako inteligentnu čutnju i takav smijeh na mjestima gdje je to potrebno, a s obzirom da ta konstatacija dolazi od osobe koja ima ozbiljno, dugogodišnje međunarodno iskustvo, onda mislim da je to veliki kompliment bosansko-hercegovačkoj, sarajevskoj i bukstanskoj publici. Hvala vam na ovom inspirativnom razgovoru i na činjenici da nam vaš autoritet pomaže da iz godine u godinu uspijevamo biti, čini mi se, ako ne bolji, onda odgovorniji. Neko me od kolega iz medija pitao da li je lakše organizovati treći festival s obzirom na iskustvo dva prethodna. Ja sam rekla da bi to bilo lakše, da svaki put sebi ne postavljamo višu ljestvicu, a zapravo to postavljanje više ljestvice je samo rezultat podrške naših kuratora i suosnivača, poput GEERT Maka, Johna Freemana, Aleksandra Saše Hermona, koji nam je i definisao generalni koncept koji podrazumijeva prostor između istoka i zapada, gdje su u središtu ljudi i njihove priče i nadam se da kroz poštovanje tog koncepta zaslužujemo i vašu pažnju i podršku. Također podršku, onu konkretnu, nam iz godine u godinu pružaju određene institucije i organizacije, pa mi dozvolite da ih kratko spomenem. Održavanje festivala i njegovog neprofitnog djelovanja omogućila je podrška Ministarstva kulture i sporta kantona Sarajevo, Federalno ministarstvo kulture i sporta, Ministarstvo civilnih poslova Bosne i Hercegovine, Fondacija za izdavaštvo te općina Centar. Programe Bookstana podržala su Fond Otvoreno društvo Bosne i Hercegovina, Ambasada Holandije, Ambasada Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, Holandska fondacija za književnost, Flamanska fondacija za književnost, Goethe institut i mreža Traduki. Institucionalni partner festivala je Akademija likovnih umjetnosti za koju se srećemo ove 3 godine, zvanični hotel festivala je Hotel Bosnija, a medijski pokrovitelji, ono što je mene osobno najvažnije, su Radio Televizija Federacije Bosne i Hercegovine, Al Jazeera Balkans, Oslobođenje, Radio Sarajevo i Behar. Bookstan se zahvaljuje svim partnerima i svim medijima, neovisno o tome da li su oficijalna podrška na kontinuiranoj podršci i praćenju festivala. Zamolit ću osnivača i suvlasnika izdavačke kuće Bajbuk Damira Uzunovića da vam se obrati, a potom i njegovu ekscelenciju, ambasadora Kraljevine Holandije u Bosni i Hercegovini, Margarita Bosa. First round.
Dobro večer, dragi prijatelji, dragi gosti. Lako je otvoriti nešto što je već počelo. Krenuli već danas u 11:30 ispred Bajbuka, malo se kiša potirala. Nevjerojatna stvar, ja sam sad šetajući od Bajbuka do do akademije, vidjeli su da imamo dva paralelna programa, jedan je tamo, a drugi je ovdje, ništa manja brojna publika nije ovdje nego tamo, dakle dva programa isto vrijeme, to nismo mislili, ovo nas već prerazilazi. Bookstan ima svoje mjesto, to je nešto što iza čega možemo staviti na važno mjesto među književnih festivala koji se dešavaju ovdje u regiji. Festival ima svoju snagu, prva da kažem koja ga nosi jeste izdavačka kuća Bajbuk koja je i organizator koja stoji iz ovog festivala sa svim svojim poslanicima i pregovorcima. Tu su izdanja koje oni rade za ovaj festival, da su 19 naslova, što je stvarno više od trećine naše godišnje produkcije. Iz ovog festivala, dok ovaj festival traje i radionica za mlade književne kritičare, urednike, buduće komentatore, književnosti, pisci i tako dalje. Snaga ovog festivala su prije svega naravno autori koji se tako lako i jednostavno odazivaju na sve ono što mi pripremimo ovdje i ono što ih pozovemo. Među njima naravno posebno mjesto i kurator i ovaj put GEERT MAK i se zahvaljujemo što je pristao na jednu ovakvu nezgodnu dužnost da pozove još drugi autori koje mi teško možemo pozvati. I Kristina rekla također jedan snaga institucije su prepoznale ovo što radimo i na kraju da kažem publika ništa bez vas koji nam dajete ovu pažnju i ima jedna važna stvar koju je GEERT MAK rekao u jednom svom intervju prije nego što je došao. Rekao je da bi volio da Sarajevo postane prijestolnica tolerancije. Mislim da toliko možemo obećati. Ja bih na kraju pozvao da festival otvori njegova ekscelencija Holandski ambasadu u Bosni i Hercegovini i da se onda kasnije družimo na ovo kad ste napočeli. Hvala vam.
A great thank you to John Freeman and GEERT MAK for this wonderful evening, very inspiring conversation. Great thank you to Bookstan and Bajbuk for not only inviting GEERT MAK and John Freeman, but also a selection of the best authors, of other best authors of the Netherlands and Belgium. They are here, you can meet them in life, you can talk to them, you can even buy books from them. And ask for a signature, and it's warm. I suppose we all go out and have a drink. Wonderful Sarajevo night. Thank you very much.